So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to another watercolor workshop on Friday afternoon. So happy to have you all here with us. I'm Lorraine Mekhla, Programming Coordinator of Loudoun County Public Library and your host today. It's my pleasure to introduce our artist. Nicola Salamani was born and raised in India and has lived in Loudoun County for over 2 decades. Much of her art is inspired by her rich, vibrant Indian culture and by the natural beauty in her new home. She's an architect and product designer by education and currently a coach in technology that influences product development, process, and delivery. Mekhla sells her paintings and original greeting cards at the Leesburg Farmers Market and donates much of her proceeds to charity. Watercolor is her favorite medium because it encourages freedom of expression. Welcome, Mekhla.
Thank you, Lorraine. It's my pleasure to be here today. I love painting and I love painting with others. So while I can't see you, I'm hoping that we will enjoy each other's company, do some watercolor painting. Yeah, I would love to hear your feedback after the session and how we can keep this improving and supporting your continuing watercolor journey. So good afternoon, everyone. I would like to first very quickly go through the material that I have set up here, and then I'm going to set it aside so we have space to work. I am using watercolor paper. This is cold pressed Arches watercolor paper. This is 100% cotton. When you're selecting paper for watercolor, paper is actually a very important element to rich colors and for how the colors move on the paper and get absorbed. So any watercolor paper that says watercolor, those will be well suited for beginners. And as you get more acquainted with colors and the paper, you can start to look for more cotton content in the paper. I have a 6x8 size paper. We are going to paint in a vertical portrait mode. Just because of the composition, it allows enough space for us to see the lavender fields. So that brushes I use today, one thicker brush. This is size 10. This the medium size is a 6, and this finer one is a size 2. These are non-branded brushes. I've had them for many years. I may have picked it up at Michael's. I would think so, because that's pretty much where I buy my art supplies. But when I'm picking brushes, I'm thinking of the brush hair that stays together and maintains its shape. And it is thick and it's not kind of weak. These have stood the test of time. So I would think any brushes that you get comfortable with, you can keep trying and see what works for you. So that's paper and brush. I'm going to put it aside for just a second. You could start with just blue, red, yellow. If you have a whole set with additional colors, that always helps, because you don't have to mix that many times to create various the variations in colors. But at the minimum, these 3 colors should do. What we also need in today's project is white. And I want to talk about white just for a minute. First of all, put your white aside until the very end of our session. We will not be using it before that. Especially in watercolor, limit the use of white and black if you can. From just a color theory perspective, white is actually presence of all colors. That's the science behind color. And black is the absence of color, like darkness. But in terms of watercolor, when you use black and mix it with water, you'll get a very faint grayish tone. You will not get a deep black. To anytime when you want to increase the depth in water painting, you could use a deep brown, a deep blue, or a deep green, depending on whether you want it reddish or greenish or bluish. But those are the colors that you use to add depth to your watercolor. So just putting aside white for the moment, because we're going to use it at the end only for some highlights. What else do I have here? Some water. clean water. I like to keep 2 containers of water because in some cases we will need just clear water, not for washing but for painting. In watercolor, water does a lot of work for us. So you really want to use water to our advantage, and only manipulate it when needed and let it do its thing, because that's where the transparency comes from. In addition to that, I have a few little things, pencil and eraser, just to draw the sketch. And as you all know, this is what we are painting today. I am also going to use tape to tape down my paper. Now, do I always tape down my paper? Do I always create a background? Not always. If you see in this one, I do have a border. I'm using this tape. It is pretty wide. It's almost like over 1/2 inches, but I wouldn't tape with such a wide border. So I'm going to make it much finer than that. Having said that, sometimes I don't put a border. It really depends on the picture and the composition, because sometimes you want the eye to draw inwards. That's where a border is helpful. There are sometimes you're creating a feel of vastness. And in those cases, I would not put a border because I want it to blend in the outside and not be limited by a border. So just some decisions as you're getting started. So here's my paper, and I'm going to tape it down. Like I said, I will only use a fine border. I have to be honest, I just want more paper to paint on, and I don't want the border to take over. So if you can see here, I just kind of use a narrow strip on the paper. Any questions in the chat?
No questions yet. I think everyone's getting ready to go.
All right.
Please do, if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box or just raise your hand and I can unmute you so you can speak with Nika directly.
That would be great. All right. So I don't know how clearly you see it in the video, but I kind of have a narrow border here. The 6x8 is a great size because this size frame is easily available too. And the frame sizes vary a little bit. So if you have a little border, you know that it's not going to cut a part of the artwork. So it works well with that too. All right, so I'm going to bring up the sketch one more time if you want to take a screenshot of this. It's a very basic sketch. There is not a lot to draw in there, but let's go ahead and do that together. While you're doing that, I would also recommend that you have a couple of pieces of paper, just extra printer paper or just scribble paper. One, we will probably use it to cover parts of the painting when we are doing the second part. It allows you to not get color smudged or color on each or hide portions where you don't want the color. So I'm going to use this to, there is a little house in here at the other end of the landscape, right? So it's a very basic house. We're not adding a lot of detail to it because it's far. And really, the house is not the subject of our painting. So it is there to suggest, but it is not the main subject. So if you see here, it's a pretty basic house shape here with a sloping roof. And on the side, when you see the slant of the roof, you want to go sideways, and this line and this line would be parallel, just so you can see the side of the house and drop the line there. Now, this is not 100% perspective, but just enough for us to draw the house in this landscape. You can put a door in there, a taller door. You do not need to draw the details of the doors and windows just yet. Just an outline should suffice. All right, that's the house. And let's see how we are placing it in the overall composition. So what I'd like to share with you is the rule of thirds. it's the golden rule in composition, whether it's photography or for any art. Whether you know it or not, we tend to follow that rule of thirds by default. Now, the reason why, so let me talk about the rule of thirds real quick. So if this is the space and it's about 9 inches, every 3 inches would be a third of the page, right? So that's the top third. And I'm going to do a horizon line, which is not absolutely straight, doesn't have to be, because the terrain land goes up and down. So just a horizontal line, slightly curved or straight, either way is just perfectly fine. So why did I divide my space into 1/3 and a 2/3? Well, in this case, if you see here, our subject is the vastness of the lavender field. So we don't want to focus too much on the sky, but we need it to complete the view. So we are going to use this for the 2/3 and a third for this. The reason why most compositions discourage dividing a space into half is because it really cuts the attention. You either look at one half or the other half, just the way the eye travels around a picture. When it's a third, it starts at one point and travels throughout. So it gives enough emphasis to everything all around it. So we got the third here, and we'll use that same rule of thirds one more time for our horizontal composition. So if I have about 6 inches here, 2 and 2, 4 is the 2/3, and then there is a third here. I'd like to place the house somewhere around here. Now, this doesn't have to be exact. It's just eyeballing, but it helps to think about where we should place our design elements. So I'm going to give everyone a minute or two to set your paper to draw this sketch. I'll keep this here while I am drawing on my paper. If there are any questions, I can take that now. I am not using a ruler or anything to draw these straight lines, because once you start painting it, you'll be fixing that. You'll have a little color on it. The colors will cover it too. But if you feel more comfortable using a scale, please feel free to do that. Now you'll see that I have a fence-like thing here, but I haven't drawn it completely because we will only see the fence just a peekaboo through the green around the house. So I'm just going to draw a line to suggest and for it to stay to the proportion, but I'm not expecting to paint that completely. I also have a few trees. These tall trees are the evergreens, and you may have seen in these European landscapes how tall they go and how lean and tall they are. So we're going to have those around the house. We are varying the sizes of this, all because we want the eye to travel around and not, if I had these trees all at the same size, I would be cutting the paper in another space and then dividing it. So you can use your design elements in the art to allow the eye to travel. You could draw a few or more, really up to you, and you can decide how you want to compose your artwork. I usually like to have a small one. I have a little oval. If you see in the sketch, I just have the trunk of a few trees here because we are not going to draw an exact tree or anything. It just suggests where the tree begins, and we will use color to do the rest. you may be making changes while you're painting, and that's perfectly fine. The colors will allow you to see how the composition is coming along, and you might decide to change a thing or two in your composition. Now, the next important thing in here is, and I'm saying it from experience, I have done that mistake a few times. I've painted such floral fields before, and every now and then, after it's all done, I realize that these lines don't look like they are converging at one point. So I decided it's best to do these guiding lines ahead of time, so I don't have to worry about the perspective. We are going to do very basic perspective. This, it may help to use a straight edge if you have it. If not, just use straight lines freehand. What I want to do in this picture is, I don't want the lines to end at the door of the house. I want it to go beyond that. So it's flat here. It's not converging at this point. But for me to start drawing and painting, I want to know where these lines will eventually converge. So if I had to extend it back, they would all meet at one point. One thing to note, you may have seen when things are closer to us, they appear bigger. When they are far, they appear smaller. So just when you're drawing, that's what you're keeping in mind too. For the sake of this one, I'm going to use the tip of the roof here and use that as my vanishing point. So I'm going to take a straight edge. This is too small, but that's fine. And I'm going to draw one here to begin with. Now, do not draw a line through the house, but beyond that, you can draw it in that field space. You see this line here? Now I put the pencil back there, the straight edge, and now I just turn the straight edge to get these radiating lines, and they all visually will converge at this tip here. So just keeping it there. This is just showing us the field and where the patches of flowers are and the path in between. Any number is fine. As you spread it out on the edges, they will go further out. So fewer on the other end. And almost none there. So I did draw a little through these. I could erase it or not even worry about it. The colors are going to cover it all. All right, pausing here for any questions, anyone? All right, then I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Let the fun with the colors begin. So if you are using just 3 colors, go ahead, Lorraine.
I wish I lived in that little house. It's so pretty.
Wouldn't that be nice? And these are my brushes here. The first step would be let water do its magic. But before I go into that, let's mix colors, and we'll talk about the colors we are using today and the colors you can mix to get those. And then I am one of those artists where I don't settle on just one color, like I want viridian green or I want Prussian blue, because the shades I want, I get to see it on my picture, and I'm constantly mixing. So I don't think I can settle down on just one name. And especially when you have the basic colors, you're constantly mixing, and you're creating colors that you think are right for your for the image. So since we will be using purples and violets a lot, red and blue would give you shades of purple and violet. Now, it really depends on the red you're using or the blue you are using. Nowadays, when I was younger, we just had 3 or 4 colors. It was easy. Now there are so many colors. You get a 36 pack and a 100 shade pack. So it gets more and more interesting. But if you use crimson red, and a shade of blue, you will be creating various shades of purple. And you could be going from a bluish purple to a reddish purple, depending on the amount of red or blue that you're adding to it. At this point, it's very tempting to add white because it will give you a nice violet, but I would recommend holding back, because once you add white, any other color that you put on top of it will start to get a pastel look, which you may not want. And so we reserve the white for later, and we will use water to lighten any color that we may want to make lighter. So let's use our scrap paper here to see how these colors are going to look. This is fairly pinkish, and this is more blue. And we will start in watercolor. Something to note, you cannot go dark to light. You can only go light to dark. So our first layer is usually a light wash. It's just like water in terms of consistency. And in most cases, we will be doing more than one layer, right? So we will add to it. Sometimes we may go wet on wet. Sometimes we will wait for it to dry and do a wet on dry. These are all watercolor techniques depending on the look and texture that you're trying to create. Right, so that's shades of purple. Play with it. Is in our project today. Doesn't matter. It could be more blue, it could be more purple, it could be more pinkish, and all of those are good. We actually will be using all of those variations. Now for the green, you would be mixing yellow and blue. Once again, if you need a yellowish blue, you will use more yellow, like you see here. This is a yellowish green, and this is a greenish blue, bluish green. You see this? Right here, you could create a whole bunch of green shades. When you're thinking spring colors, I'm thinking of the yellowish green. When you're thinking of a summer forest, you're looking at the darker greens. So some of those colors are so suggestive. Sometimes you put one color on paper and then blend it in with another shade. The beauty of watercolor is the blending. Right, and if I want to make this even darker, I'm going to add more blue, make it a really dark green. So that's pretty much the range of colors we are working in today. So feel free to play with the mix, see what works best for you, and go from there. Of course, practice will help, and you will develop your own style. What I like to do here is I do have kitchen napkins that I wipe my brushes in. But what I also like to do is keep 2 or 3 tiny pieces aside, because in watercolor, there'll be some very wet spots, and we'll use that to our advantage to create some effects without using the brush sometimes. All right. And I have a really blue water here, so I'm going to dump this and get some clear water. If you have any questions, just give me 10 seconds and I'll give you some time to get all set up with your colors. I got some more water and I'm keeping clean water in reserve for, actually we will start with clean water. Right, any questions?
Questions so far, Cheryl? I mean, Mika, sorry.
All right. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm using the thickest brush, and we will start with the sky. We're going to keep the sky really minimal because there are some projects, some pictures that sky is very dramatic and that is the subject. today the sky is completing the view, but it's not the main subject. So I'm using plain clear water, my thick brush. All I have in the brush is water right now, and I'm going to do a light wash of just water. Now start from the top and go closer to the trees, but not all the way in here. Just around the house. You don't have to be perfect, but don't go on the house. No, it's hard to see on camera what I'm doing, but I'm going to put color on it. This is our wet on wet watercolor technique. Now that I have the paper wet, I'm going to get a little bit of blue, very light, with a lot of water. So very watery consistency. I'm going to use another palette. While I'm at it, I personally like ceramic white palettes because I get to see the color better than any other colored palette. And it, I can make color decisions looking at how it's looking here. So on my wet paper, I'm using really light blue. It's more water than color. It's water consistency. And I'm going to just touch my brush on the wet parts. Only the top. I don't have to go over it too much. In fact, watercolor gets a little stale and doesn't look that fresh if we overdo it. We will be doing that in the field part, but for the sky, just leave it with a few strokes. Don't go all the way to the bottom for now. And let the water do its thing. Now I am going to use a little bit darker blue just to blend it in. And we are going to leave it at that. Another thing to note about watercolor, it fades when it dries. So you do have to plan a bit for the color that you would like it to be when you finish the work. So sometimes, but it takes practice, and I often feel like, hey, I should have stopped a little bit before. But every now and then you have to remind yourself, add a little bit more color because this is going to dry lighter. So that's our sky. This is where our little kitchen napkin comes in. And without using the brush, use a really small tip. Our paper is not very big, and just dab it a little bit to create a little cloud there. It's not a very cloudy image. We just want some patches of white here, and that's really it. If you think it could use a little bit more color, take some more blue to go around the part where you put some white patches, but I would keep that to a minimal. Gonna stop there. I know that a little part of the paper here is also wet. That's where I'm gonna bring in the green, a little lighter green and very watery. And I'm just leaving the first tone of green in place to create the first layer. We're going to add the details later, but this is just to set the base layer. And once again, don't have to overwork this, just leave it there. I would recommend not blending the blue and green, but the water will do it already for us. And you want that to bleed. As you see things far away, you don't see the defined edges of each. So you just want to kind of give a little bit shape of trees going up and down, but we don't have to do every detail of it at this point. All right. So now we're going to let that dry and come back and focus and start with the first layer at the bottom. Wash the brush clean. We are still using the big brush. In the first layer, usually we will be using larger brushes because that's where we're doing the first lighter layer. Now that we have these radiating lines, we are going to decide two things. One, closer to the line, we'll do the purple bands of flowers and then leave some space out for the walkway. Before we get into that, especially in watercolor, actually for any painting, there's one more thing. One thing you decide is the perspective. Where is the vanishing point, which is here for us? And the other thing is you want to determine where the light is. In your mind, you should have it set that the light is coming from a certain point, and that will decide which areas we leave lighter and which areas we add more depth to. So in this case, let's see the picture. You see here, there's light here, so it's coming from the top somewhere. And the flower beds have a dark tone on this side, which means the light is coming from here and the shadows are falling on the inner side. All right. So with that in mind, that's how we will be using our colors. Light is coming from here, top and right, going this way. So I'm going to use some yellow. Because that's the color of sunshine. And we will add other colors to it later. So that's my yellow and also a very water consistency. I'm going to start with the bottom with the stroke going up. Now this we are doing dry on dry. So we're starting from here. And as we decided, the flower bed will be here. So I need the walkway to be in this part. You want to start from the bottom, go upwards and leave it. You don't want to fill in color. You just start here, drag the brush a little halfway and then leave it. Because as things go further away from us, they start to disappear into that vanishing point. So we just add more color and let it go. This layer is also going to set that perspective, and we'll continue to follow those lines. Further away from here, if this is where we're seeing this landscape from, you won't see a lot of light further away. It's going to all blend in. And I made a mistake here because I started from the top. I should have done this. So in watercolor, you could, I want to remove some color from here. So I washed my brush, wiped it dry, and I'm going to do color lifting. So this is a brush with no color and it's still wet. So I'm going to put it down and I'm just lifting color. So I removed the color that I put there. That's a watercolor technique called lifting. How are we doing so far, everyone?
Everyone's busy painting.
That sounds good. I use a lot of kitchen paper. This is already soaked, but this is watercolor. Don't need a lot of color, but you need a lot of water. If you're seeing blends like these, it's perfectly fine. We are going to be adding a lot of details on top of that. Now comes our purple. First round of purple. I'm going to keep it very, very light and very, not a bright purple. I just want it mid-tone blue or purple. So while this looks like a lot of purple here, but if I put it on paper with so much water, it won't be a lot. It won't be too bright. Now we are going to do the same we did with the yellow tones. In the white space, this is where our flower beds are. Same technique, we're starting with at the base and take the brush through halfway and then let it go. And you want these blends. So don't worry about the color blending into the yellow because that's where, that's how it'll look realistic. The closer it is to the viewpoint, the brighter the color could be. At this point, I recommend do not blend too many different colors. We want to keep it fresh until we decide to add the details. Too many color blends tend to make the picture muddy. And, you know, a pretty scene like this, you want it to be fresh and attractive. All right. So we let this dry a little bit. And for now, let's go back to the top part, which may have dried. I do see I have a water blob here. I'm going to go back and use my little kitchen towel and lift some color from there. I don't want it white, but I don't want a pool of water, so I can always bring in some green and fix that. I think I need a little yellow here. You can already see the colors are fading as it's drying, but that's okay since this is our first layer. We'll be adding a lot more color to it. Right. While we wait for the bottom 2/3 of this to dry, we'll go back to the top. And for the house, we want to use a little brown tone. I mean, you could decide if you wanted the house to pop, you could probably make a red house, like a barn. In this case, I want the focus to be here on the lavender field, so I'm going to do tones of brown. To create a brown, I've switched to a smaller brush because of the space in the house. It's a smaller area to cover, so I want to stay within the lines. We'll start with the red, add some green, and create a brown. So green is yellow and blue, and we're adding it to red. So technically it's red, green, red, yellow, and blue to create a brown. Now, this color to me seems like a really thick consistency. I want it to be very watery because also for the house, this is our first layer. We don't want to start with a dark and then realize that we wanted it to be a different color. So we just start with a really light tone. I'm going to start with just getting the shape of the front of the house, holding off on the door just for a little bit so I can make sure that I have the shapes right. Now I do want a little yellow. It looks a little drab. And remember, we talked about the light coming from here. So on the house too, when the light is falling here, this half of the house will be brighter than the other half. So when we start to do the details in the house, we'll start to add more dark on the sides that are away from the sun. I just want to take a slightly different variation of the brown by adding a little red to maybe have terracotta style roof. Once again, we'll be adding more details to it, but just leaving some color there to basically claim the space for the house on your composition so that when we are doing the trees, we know where to stop and where to overlap. All right. So far, so good. Now, one of my favorite things to do is to paint trees. And we're not doing anything specific, but bring in all your shades of blues and greens and yellows. This is the fun part. Follow the light in the picture. The yellows more on this half of the tree and the dark tones on the other. If you look at it here, you see these tall evergreens. You see the yellow tones here blending with the darker on the other side. So this is the side that's facing the light. For all of our decisions, light here and dark there will guide us to add depth. So I'm going to switch to the middle tone to start with, and then we'll add a few more details with the darker or with the finer brush. I'll start with a middle tone green, and just checking if this is dry enough, because if these are not dry, you'll get a very wide bleed, which you don't want for this because these trees have a pretty defined space. Now, what I did is I started from the center of that sketch, because if there was any bleeding, it would still bleed within the shape and not, just expand too much. And you know what, if that happens, we'll change the type of tree. You're the artist, you have the control, and you can create variances. So it seems like this is okay right now. So I'm starting with the middle tone. I usually like to have a half tree, incomplete tree on the edges, because it just looks like, it's not all so fixed, but it's a continuous space. You see how I brought in a much bluer here to get the darker effect. I'm going to come back to this with some light. Here, it's a tall tree, so I'm going to get a lot more light. There are a few obstructions. It will catch more light, so it will have more yellow tones than the shorter trees closer to the ground. So start with the yellow tone, add the middle tone green, and then go for a darker bluish green on this side. Since this is a shorter tree, it'll be darker. Like I just said, it won't be catching that much light. And especially when a tree or any element is under another element or covered by any other element, you all know how we get shadows, and it's dark in those spaces. So anything closer or in a cluster will be darker than the elements that are in the open. I sometimes feel like I wash off more color than I use in watercolor, but that's the reality of it. Some artists like to use multiple brushes. I tend to get lost in picking the right brush and I lose the flow, so I just use one brush and keep changing the colors. Closer to this where there is an overlap, give it some space, but a little blur would be great too. A darker to this side. I look at it, I do want a little definition to the base where the field, it's actually a change of planes. This is flat and the trees are vertical. So we just kind of mark that with the brush. Now while we're waiting for that to dry, I'm switching over to the finer brush, using a really dark brown that we had mixed for the tree, and being very careful that if it's dry, we can start with a little bit of the impressions of the branches, which we don't need much of, just to guide us where to place the foliage of the tree. I'm just going to leave it at that. Usually when we're not doing a lot of details, it's a good idea to have a little tree or something by the house which covers the edge, and we don't have to go in there and do every detail of the edge of the house. What I did here, and we'll be doing more of that, it's a darker tone of green, bluish green. And literally with the tip of the brush, we are just doing dots and blending lights and darks. What I should not have done is I started with the darker tone. Maybe I would put in some yellows. This is just yellow as is. I'm gonna let it dry and then add more colors. But I want to lock in the lighter shades because I won't be able to do that once I bring in the dark shades. We're doing much of this wet and wet. What I paint today, one thing I know for sure that it won't be the same as this. And you can be certain yours won't be like anyone else's here. While we are using the same technique, the same composition, they will all be different. It'll be unique and it'll have its own character. Everyone has a different style of using the brush, blending, but I'm pretty sure it'll all look nice in their own unique ways. And as you try these techniques, you will realize that you're going to add your own unique design or technique to it and create something really beautiful. So you see, we just created a tree there. We're going to do the same on the other side while the lavender field first layer is drying. I realized I took too much color at the tip of my brush, so I just took some water and I'm blending it right there. You see, I'm going to stick to more yellows on this side with the yellowish green, a fresh yellowish green here. At this point, the consistency is a little thicker than the first layer because we are now creating the objects on top of that layer. It's still very watery, but not, the proportion of water is a little bit more than before. I'm also going to do some bushes here to give it a nice green backdrop. I'm thinking evergreens, and evergreens are usually a little conical in shape, then they narrow at the top and wider at the bottom. This is just literally very dark blue, and it's going to blend by itself on the paper. So I'm going to go back to this tree to just talk about how closer to the center of the tree the color would be darker because it's dense there, so not a lot of light gets in, and you color it a bit dark there, and on the outer sides you have a fresher, greener shade. Remember we talked about, I'm hiding the edge of the house here too because I don't want to worry about the exact perspective. That's not where my focus is for today's artwork. Right, washing my brush. And as I mentioned, I do not use black in watercolors. Well, it's not a rule. If you need to use it, you could. But let me show you what I mean by that, right? I just took some black. This is black from my color box. There's my paper. And if I use a lot of water in it and paint with it, this is what I'm going to get. This is black with water. So this doesn't help me get much depth. What I'm going to use is much thicker blues and greens and reds to get if I want a brownish deep tone, I'm going to use more red. or more blue. And these colors are really, really deep. So you see how deep this is? And I'm using a thicker consistency. And this here is used for the depth, which, you know, earlier I would think it would be black, but it does the job of black. So the reason why I mixed this almost black deep color is because I wanted to just do a light impression of a fence going through here. We could also wait to do this later because it's too wet and we want that to actually stand out and we don't want it to blend. So I'm going to hold off. I do get impatient, so I'll come back to it later. Any questions in the chat? How's everyone doing? Painting is a lot like doing experiments. It's just you do start with something in mind on where you're going, but you are always surprised at how it turns out. You can never know exactly how it's going to be, and that's why I feel like, you know, even I can't recreate what I did the previous time. I do want to call out now that I'm seeing that happen on my palette. I had some white from before, and it started to mix with the blues and greens here, and I'm getting a pastel shade, which I don't want to use because I won't be able to make it a natural color later. So I'm going to put this palette aside, at least not using the white color there, or the white blends. All right, so while we'll come back to the house and the details later, and we are going to go and work on the flower field, the lavender. So we're coming back with our thicker brush still. This is layer 2, and we are using a more purple color, if you may, than before, just because we want to have that flower tone starting to add here. Same technique. We are now just adding the next layer from here. Same thing, and you want it to just run in there. There. You want to show a little bit of the lighter tone because that's where you'll start to see the shades of the flowers, lights and darks blend. So we're not completely covering everything, just adding more tones of lavender. Leaving it at that. We're going to go back to our greens in the path here. We started with yellow because we can't do yellow on top of green, but we can do green on top of yellow. So this is the patch, the walking path in between the lanes of flower. And I'm using a middle tone watery green to demarcate this. Same technique, we're starting with the bottom edge and just letting it run into the vanishing point. So the time where we can start adding a little bit more brighter green. While I do that, I want to make sure that I wash my brush, go back to a nice lemon yellow, a fresh yellow, and give it a little yellow wash here to make sure that we still have the light sunny part of the landscape. So you see here, we're doing a glaze with a much lighter fresh yellow. So we did the opposite here. We're starting from the top and going, blending it into the lanes of flowers. At this point, if you have any tone of pink or crimson, take a little of that and make this a little bit more pink to add variations in color because that's how flowers are. They'll have a lot of tones, various variations. At this point, I'm still using a thick brush, but I'm not doing that sweep brush stroke. I'm going to just dab it while the base is still wet. So there's a little blending, but you still see all the colors. Once again, the parts of the picture that are closer to the viewpoint here, you'll see more structure to or definition to what you have. And then as it goes there, you're just going to let it blend. At this point, I would like to put a little on the green. So it's not like completely divided. The flowers will be on the green with all the stems. They'll be overlapping a little bit. So you see with the more pinker of the or reddish lavender color or purple or violet, you're doing these dabs of paint. What we are painting today is expressionist art. It's not realistic. We are not painting every flower, every stem, but we are looking at the impression we get when we look at it from far. I would hold off on doing a very blue tone just yet because we will be using the darker blue or bluish violet to do the depth or the shadows on the other side. So stay within the range of a little bit more reddish and lighter for now. The further away it is, the more blended it's going to be. I'm not going to add a lot of details to it. And let it all blend in. I dropped water on the sky. I'm doing the opposite. I have cleaned my brush. I have clear water. I'm wiping this. The brush is dry. I'm going to place it here and I'm lifting color because I want to blend, but I don't want to add color to the blend. We've talked about quite a few techniques. We talked about wet on wet. We talked about dry on dry, wet on dry, and lifting color. I think my painting here could use a little bit more fresh green. I'm starting to see and feel like it's a little brown and dull. Similar, just do a little dab closer to this edge to get the variance in color. We have a little yellow at the base. We have some greens and lighter greens. We will come back and touch it up with a darker green, a fresh green. Try to blend the edges, not as a hard blend, but dab it in and the water will help you blend some of those colors. It is very wet here. We are going to let it dry. It's really wet. We need to just let this sit. All right, let's go back to our house. add a little details while we wait for this part to dry. Any questions in the chat? Comments?
No questions, but someone is saying it's very easy to follow and beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's good feedback. It's good to know. Going back to the browns. Now I'm taking a little bit more color in my brush so it's not as watery because we are starting to add some definition to the house. I'm going to start with the edge of the roof. Make sure that we have that right. I'm going to do this edge to define the slope on one side, the vertical wall. And on the same brush, I'm now adding a little bit more water and doing the dark tone here. Darker color, but with more water, because we have light coming from one side and the other is in shade. So this is your light and that's the dark. Let that dry. It's a little too wet for me to do the door and window details. But I'm gonna go back. I realized that I could use a little blending of the edges here on the where the house meets the ground. Maybe this is a good time to put the fence in while we are waiting for some other elements to dry. This fence you see here, it's only a little bit, but it's suggestive that there is a fence in the back. Maybe you see some of it, you don't see all of it. It's very suggestive only. That's it. That's it for the fence. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I want to show you on my scrap paper on how I do a brick texture. I just absolutely love doing this. So we started with a lighter tone. This is not brown enough, but let's say it's this. When this dries, I take the smaller brush, this one, with a very slightly darker tone of the brown, but not a lot of deep color. And while it looks like brick, you don't have to draw every brick. You start with the edge, do one, do another, and just leave it out. Maybe do one in between. And you're just suggesting that this wall has some texture, or rocks, or a stone finish to the wall. When it's all done from far, you will only see the texture, and it is suggestive enough to show the texture or the material of the wall, but you don't have to do every detail. So I'll do that here. We have to wait for it to dry just a little bit, so it's not too wet for it to completely blend in. So I'm a huge fan of exposed brick texture on the wall. So every time I get a chance, I'm going to do a little bit of that. Too small for it to show. I think it's almost dry. I can do an outline to the door. Not going to worry about much detail here. Come back and add another tone to it. It's up to you, the design. Going back to my brown tone. I'm going back and forth mainly because I'm waiting for these to dry a little. You could just do it all at once and then do the next part. I'm just using my time here while I'm waiting for one to dry and finishing up other areas. So even on the slope of the roof, you could take a little bit of a darker tone to define this edge, then wash it, wipe it, dry it, and then run the brush on it for it to blend. You see the trick we used? We put the little tree there and we don't have to worry about every detail of the edge. At this point, I feel like the trees could use another fresh coat of green just for them to pop. So middle tone green, just fresh color, and going over that. Sometimes when you see that the colors don't have much luster, you can do another technique called, now I'm losing that word. It's called, I was just saying the word and I forgot. Oh, anyway, it'll come back to me. It's a brain freeze. That's so disturbing. All right, with the same fresh green, I'm going to go back and add a little bit more variety in the green tones here in the field. So you see we are building layer by layer by layer. So the many tones and shades and variations in colors that you see is from this, the many layers we are building one on top of the other. Now the green I just use, I feel like it's too green, not so natural. So I'm going to go in there with maybe a little bit of a yellower green and blend that in, and then it won't pop as much. You're constantly making those decisions on when to stop, when to add some color. It's your eye that's the best judge. I also hear from many other artists that when you think your watercolor is complete, put it aside, come back to it a day later. Don't see it for some time, then you will know what else is required or if it's really done. Now what I did here is this part of the picture is fairly dry and I don't want to do any more wet on wet. So I took color in my brush and went onto that spaces, started here where I can use more color. And then when the color on my brush is very less and dry, then I'm just dabbing it here. You see, I want to get a little texture. So it's dry on dry. And I use up the excess color in these spaces. And then when I feel like there isn't much color, then I put it on here. All right, how are we doing on time? We have about 15 minutes more. I need a little bit more.
All right, yes, about 15 minutes.
All right, so a little bit more sunshine here. So I am going to use watery yellow. I am really at this point waiting for this to dry a little bit more because we're going to put some splatter on it that'll look like flowers. And we'll do just some suggestion of stems to show the direction of the plants and the flowers. So what could I be doing until then? Oops, too much water. How about we draw some birds? Very dark tone from here, almost black. It could be brownish or bluish. Your finest brush. Wipe it on your paper towel for very little color. You don't want this to be big. See, this is a perspective. Whatever is far is really, really tiny. And the birds are, if you plan to draw the birds, just keep them really small. To start off, just the letter V shape should be more than sufficient to suggest. Or if you want to use a pen, that's fine too. You may have better control using a pen in this case. Or even your pencil should be enough. If you don't want to use a pen, that's fine. I'm switching over to a fine tip black pen, just doing a little V, and that's it. All right, well, you could use this time to catch up, ask questions, chat, comment.
Questions? I want to type my email address here, and if you want to send me a copy of what you've painted, I'd love to see it, and I can share it with you.
That would be wonderful. You can tell I can't wait. I'm impatient. I'm adding a little yellow tones here, and I'm going to come back to add the darker shades and shadows soon after this.
Surprisingly similar to the original, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah,
that's unusual. Usually, it looks a little different every time you do it.
you still have to add a layer of depth to make these the flower beds pop, for it to get that third dimension. That's what we are waiting to do now. While we are waiting, we could also take the red color that you have, or actually just use red with a very little bit of blue, more red, more pink or red, to add one layer of those colors. So now you see I'm using my finer brush. I don't want big splatter now. I'm starting to add the details, starting from the bottom edge. This is the next layer of flowers. It's fairly dry here, so it's really no shape. I'm just touch, 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 scribble, just smaller than the touch we had before. Now I want it to be more defined on this the lower edge that's closer to the eye, and then we are going to leave it at that. Still have to use our white. That's going to help us add those highlights at the end. The further away it is, I want a more watery consistency because I don't want it to pop too much. It's far. And I'm doing that same dry technique here. Let's add in the depth with the dark color. I'm going to use just the dark blue, but we won't put a lot of water. If I put a lot of water in the blue, I'm going to get a blue when I paint, right? But if I don't put too much water and I use thick color now, it'll look like black, see? Or you add a little red to it to get a deeper dark brown, like this, see? This is what we are using as our black. Now we want to use a very little of this. The sunlight is coming from this side, so this edge is where it is dark. I'm just going to do a simple dark tone here. Doreen, how many participants do we have today?
I'm sorry?
How many participants do we have today?
17.
Oh, that's a good number.
Yeah, it's a good number.
I hope it's your Friday afternoon well spent. All right, so you see this is darker here, blends in, doesn't have to be too defined. I am going back to my thick brush, washing it, drying it, and taking clear water. Very little, not a lot this time. We are going to go back and do a little bit of the lifting for blending from this point in with just a little bit of water. So it doesn't look like we forgot to color a part of it. And it blends into. Press it down harder so it can actually sweep some color out. If that doesn't work, you could also bring back your little kitchen towel, the small, tiny piece. Also start from this point and brush it out a little. Right, we are almost getting there, waiting for this last layer to dry a bit. A little overlap on this tree to get a third dimension. And a little tree here too. I feel like these are a little thicker and wider than I would have liked. So just using this time to add something on top, reduce the effect of the size. Could use some. All right, moving on to our almost the last step, I'm sure. Actually, no, last but one. So remember we talked about keeping a scrap piece of paper to cover some parts. I'm going to move water away from your work, move your palette away and anything that's wet. We want to do a white splatter on top of it. Because we used base colors, we don't have a lot of white. And when you look at things that are closer to us, you will see the positive and negative space. You'll see some white. So we are adding that white here, which is almost the end of the work, because like we mentioned before, we don't want to put white and then we end up getting a lot of pastel colors. So the part where there is a lot of sunshine, that is that's washed out, right? So you don't want any details in that space. The details are more in this area. So I'm going to cover about half of this lightly, and while I'm going to get white color ready for a splatter. So the way we do a splatter is I'm going to use my middle size brush and use another brush to just use like this, and we'll do the splatter by tapping one brush on the other. So I'm going to cover this with my palm, just keep this stick and splatter. Right now I don't have any color. For this, you want white to be as opaque as possible. So Until now, we were using color for its transparency. Now we want the white to stick. We don't want it to blend. If you have heard of gouache, gouache is opaque watercolor. I have this, but you can see it's not clean. I've used it a lot. Not a lot is remaining, but I'm going to take some of that. Or you could use the white color that's in your box, or you have it. Just use a thick consistency of that. So I'm going to use this. See how thick it is? And I am using only a little bit of water, unlike before, just enough for it to be, for the brush to nicely wrap in a lot of color and still be able to splatter with it. When you have more color, more water, you'll get big splatters. When you have a finer brush and less color, you'll get finer splatter. So you see, I'm really loading up the brush with color here. This is thick white color. There is my base brush, and we're going to just tap it. You see the little white dots? When I get the big splatter, I'm going to keep it closer to the bottom edge. Now I'm starting to get fine splatter because the color is a lot less than when it was when I started. So I'm going to move a little bit upward to get the fine splatter. Anything closer is bigger, anything further away is smaller, and that's how we are using this splatter. Now that I have very little color, I can move the paper a little bit and splatter here too, so it doesn't look like a patch of splatter, but it blends into the washed out space. Can use some more of it. This is also allowing us to create another dimension for the flowers. This does mess up your workspace a lot, but it's watercolor. You can wipe it off from most surfaces. Right. Now, if you think it's too much or too little, you can do the same thing with another color. If you want more pink or more purple, you can use a thicker, another color and do a little splatter. I just got some pink just to add another tone to it. And I'm going to stop at that because I have to remind myself I usually at this point tend to overdo, and I start to think, why did I do that? I should have just stopped. So using that pink to add another shade here, just closer to the bottom edges. That splatter. Maybe the top could use a little bit. All right, that's another technique. Now what remains is to just give draw some stems to give a sense of the direction and movement of these plants. I'm taking a really dark green, a color that will show up on what we have. What I'm struggling with is it's still a little wet. You may not have it handy right now. I'm going to use it. I keep a hair dryer handy, just any hair dryer that you have at home. And the lighter things will fly, so be careful to help dry your work if you're in a rush. I try not to use it because I feel like it fades the color too quickly, but that's fine. Now I have really dark green in my brush and a finer brush. And all I'm going to do is draw some grass-like stems, nothing too specific, just long strokes, bottom to top. When you start with the brush loaded in color, you get a thicker base and then it becomes narrower, and that's what you want it to look like. And when the brush has less color, you do smaller strokes a little into the field but not too far in. You won't be seeing much details into the field, just a few here at the edge. And if you plan to go a little further inside, make sure you reduce the color in your brush, add more water, because further inside your colors won't be so visible, won't be the same tone. So I just made it a lot lighter, a lot more water to just define this path a little bit more with some green stems. But that's pretty much it. I think, Lorraine, we are at time, and this is one very important thing. Don't forget to sign your work. That's the fun part. I'm pausing here. I'm going to continue doing a little bit of the grass, but opening it up for questions or any comments anyone has.
Compliments, Mika. Thank you. I have to run. Really enjoyed. Have a great weekend. Thank you, guys. This is awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. You all just made my Friday so much more special.
You're a good teacher.
Thank you, Lorraine. I think it's the love for painting. All right, that's it. If you are still here, this is really fun when you remove the tape. Technique here too, pull the tape away from your picture. Some paper may rip and it'll spoil your work, so pull it out. And it's actually so much fun to do this. Most satisfying part. There you go.
Everybody likes how theirs came out and had fun with us this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. And please check the library's calendar for more watercolor workshops. We'll have 2 more the first 2 weeks of June. And we also have recordings on Loudoun County Public Library's YouTube page. So check those out as well. Bye-bye and have a great weekend.